My name is Steve Reed, and I'm a geologist with the Department of Earth and Space Sciences at Morehead State University. My role in the Dry Creek watershed planning process is to get a handle on the sediment pollution. Of course, my students and employees are the ones that do most of the work, but what I'd like to do today is to give you an idea of what we found through the work we've done for the past year and a half and will continue into the future. There are a number of problems associated with suspended sediment. The suspended sediment is what you see after a big rain and the stream comes roaring down through there and it's all muddy. That mud is actually silt and clay that's being carried up in the water, and as long as that water is moving and stirring itself up, then that fine-grained sediment stays up in the water column and clouds the water. Because it clouds the water, it tends to reduce the sunlight to plants and algae, and that has a tendency then to limit plant and algal growth. Since many organisms then require this plant and algae, it can have consequences further up the food chain. The problem with the muddy water also is that the sun is able to warm it better, and it gets warmer in general, and that decreases the amount of oxygen in the water, which can also have adverse effects for the organisms living in the streams. Perhaps less well known is the tendency for the clay in the suspended sediment to attract chemicals and bacteria. These chemicals and bacteria can literally attach themselves to the clay and then be carried through runoff towards the stream and be carried further downstream and eventually deposited somewhere. So here you'll have clay and silt deposited on the bottom of the stream somewhere that now has things like pesticides, lawn chemicals, and bacteria from livestock or pets or even humans attached to it, and it's down in that sediment. The problem then with that, not only being somewhat toxic, is that once that sediment settles somewhere, it has a tendency to smother spawning beds and also to take up space where normally aquatic organisms would live, which again has detrimental effects on the life forms that are in this stream. And finally, the settling of the sediment in the stream channels can take up space where water would usually be carried unless you remobilize the sediment. But by taking up that space, the water has nowhere else to go but out of the channel if possible, and that can lead to more flooding. This is a photograph taken from where the Highway 519 bridge crosses Dry Creek, not too far from the Clearfield Post Office. And this is looking upstream towards the confluence of Morgan Fork coming in on the right, and then of course you can see some of the apartment buildings further up Dry Creek Road. Morgan Fork is the stream that flows parallel to 519 all the way up towards the top of Clack Mountain. And you can see on the right where it's coming in, it is really loaded with mud, in essence silt and clay that's being carried in suspension. And you can see where it's combining with the somewhat greener looking clear waters of Dry Creek. But by the time Dry Creek gets close to where the photographer is standing, the muddy water from Morgan Fork has been stirred up enough into the channel to where now the whole stream of all of Dry Creek is pretty laden with suspended sediment. This is a photograph of a young man measuring discharge, which is the amount of water that flows down the stream. So in the time that he was out there taking his measurements, he's standing in water now that is relatively clear. It does contain some suspended sediment, but compared to the picture that I'm going to show you, which was taken a half an hour later when he gets ready to do a sediment sampling, you'll see quite a difference in the clarity of the water. So a mere 30 minutes later, the young man has the specialized bottle that he's dipping into the water to collect the sample that we'll use to measure the sediment in there. And you can see that the stream is much cloudier than it was in the previous photograph. Most likely in this case, it was probably due to the construction on 519, because this site is downstream of the confluence of Morgan Fork and Dry Fork, or Dry Creek, that I showed you previously. This is a photograph taken just downstream of the point where the young man was taking the sediment sample in the previous slide. And what it shows is a time when the stream is lower and the velocity of the water is much slower. The entire bottom of the stream is covered in a fairly thick layer of silt and clay that's covering the bedrock and covering some of the gravel chunks that you see in the photo. So what this represents is the sediment from the cloudy water having settled on the bottom. This sedimentation and siltation is an impairment recognized by the Kentucky Division of Water in Dry Creek.